going to start with a story. Just as I was beginning seminary, my congregation moved to a new building, and I was a part of helping renovate the space to make it suitable for Unitarian Universalists. First and foremost, that meant removing the giant wooden cross from the front of the room. If you're new, I need to clarify, UUs don't have a problem with crosses, we're not vampires. There's lots of people who are both UU and Christian, but there's humanist UUs and agnostics and Buddhists and pagan UUs. So a cross at the front of the room would have been just lifting up one perspective. So the theology of that was clear, but in practical terms, turns out wood is quite heavy. That phrase, cross to bear, is not just a pretty metaphor. Getting this thing off the wall was a feat of engineering and a near-death experience. And now what? This giant cross wasn't going to fit in the back of my minivan to be hauled away. It would need to be cut into pieces. But you can't use the power saw in the sanctuary because sawdust flies everywhere, and there was an informal rule about no more power saws in the sanctuary, Liz. It was on the verge of becoming a formal rule. So this was the line of thinking that led me to a conversation with my friend Anne, who is a woman of great maturity and perspective. This is a sensitive time for your neighbors, Anne explained, with the loss of the church that shrank until they couldn't afford their building. Your new neighbors will be grieving. But there's also great potential for new connection, for inviting people in. And Liz, the community's introduction to Unitarian Universalism cannot be you taking a power saw to a cross on the front lawn of the old church. Find somewhere else to do it. I'm not sure how the cross was removed in the end. For some reason, they didn't involve me any further, but it got done. But here's the thing. It had hung there for many years beside the huge vaulted window through which light streamed down. And it's true what they say. Light really does transform everything it touches, particularly on a time scale of years. And so now the paint around the cross had grown distinctly lighter, and the paint behind the cross had not so much. So now immediately beside the pulpit was a clear stenciled outline. This could have been solved by repainting, of course. But in order to do that, we would have had to agree on paint colors. And the decorating committee pointed out that the colors for the paint couldn't be chosen until the fabric of the new chairs that would replace the pews had been chosen. And the worship committee felt that we couldn't commit to removing the pews until we talked about how we embody our identity and our relationship to authority in the structure of our worship space. And you get where this is going. For many months, we did not worship beside a giant cross. Instead, we worshiped beside the very conspicuous shadow that was cast by its absence. A giant Jesus was here symbol stenciled high above our heads. It was there in more ways than one. On the literal wall, of course, but also in the conspicuous role that the Protestant tradition we come from plays in everything we do. It's in the tunes of the songs we sing and the fact that we meet on Sunday mornings, often in a building owned explicitly for that purpose. We have expanded our theology, but the way that we embody that theology has not changed very much in centuries. To me, the shadow of the cross on the wall on Sunday mornings is a physical manifestation of a structure that was frozen in time. It said, we have decided to do things differently, but we aren't actually doing that yet because all the details are still stuck in committee. So around the time of this shadow of the cross business, I was feeling stuck in committee myself. I was deeply in love with Unitarian Universalism and its values, and I was expressing that love by going to seminary. Where we talked about this shadow of the cross stuff, we wouldn't have used that language, but we talked about how social change has been threatening traditional institutions like legacy media, academia, and church, and how we could expand our structures to adapt to those threats. But we had those conversations in a university, mirroring the old ways of doing things with every detail of our structure, with all the expense that goes with academia, and the inertia and the gatekeeping. By approaching the issue from only that perspective, we were taking down the cross but continuing to function within the confines of its shape. So I suck at all of this. Even when I'm not critiquing the premise of school, I am a terrible student. Forcing my brain to study has always felt like trying to wrestle an active toddler into a car seat. I had long since received an ADHD diagnosis, which is the medical term for the active toddler car seat situation. And I had received medication and behavioral suggestions and all the messages that go with all of that. At the time, I saw myself as disordered and the wrong shape for school. But I loved Judaism, and this was how you served it. So I was determined to squeeze into the shape that was being asked of me. I mean, sometimes. On my better behaved days, I was determined. On other days, I would skip all the stuff we were supposed to be studying and do what I love to do, which is laugh. And I remember one day procrastinating on my homework, watching these comedians on YouTube and thinking, hey, wait a second. They're talking about the exact same ideas as people in the books I am supposed to be reading. Big topics, often tricky ones. Stand-up comedians tackle all of it. Race, religion, money, ethics. But they do it in a way that's funny, that's accessible to everyone. And that was the beginning of a doorway in me. Maybe the fact that I had trouble paying attention to high academia wasn't just a flaw that would make me a crappy minister, although I do believe I would have been a crappy minister had I finished school. Maybe those same traits, though, were what would allow me to talk about the same topics ministers do in a format of a way that's easier to pay attention to, maybe even funny. And the farther I moved from a powerless position of a grade school child, the more assertive that thought became. I would sit in my school lectures and the usual messages would run through my mind. The problem is, I need to be better at paying attention. But now there was this little voice that argued back, that argued, how come it's always that I have to work harder to pay attention? I have been working hard for years. How come my professors never have to work any harder at being easier to pay attention to, huh? When it wasn't dry, the stuff I was learning was also, it was not what I had expected. I had always had these stories of our history in my head, like Michael Servetus, a Unitarian martyr, chased, persecuted, and ultimately burned at the stake for his brave act of speaking the truth to John Calvin. So it turns out, if you read Servetus' writing in his own words, he's very smart, he's very articulate, he's also obnoxious. He doesn't just tell his truth, he stalks John Calvin. He writes letters arguing every little point of anything Calvin says. At one point, Calvin has a warrant out for Servetus' arrest. Servetus attends one of Calvin's talks, sits in the front row, and stares him down. He was like the worst kind of internet troll, but in real life. Servetus did not deserve what happened to him. Of course, nobody deserves that. But after reading his actual words, dripping with arrogance and condescension, there was like this piece of me that was on John Calvin's side. I mean, Servetus, I know that guy. I have chaired meetings containing that guy. Sometimes I have been that guy in the meeting. He is the best of us in some ways and the worst of us in others. Or Emerson and Thoreau, that was another one. I had always admired the transcendentalists, how they forged these intentional, beautiful lives of integrity. Learning a little bit more about it, Thoreau could retreat to the woods to suck the marrow out of life because he was living the land Emerson gave him to use for free. Where'd that land come from originally? And the story about how Thoreau was making the bold choice to live a simple life in the woods? I think we could say that Thoreau didn't invent the idea of living simply in those woods. In fact, before his people arrived, simple was the only way anybody ever lived there. There was this whole system supporting Thoreau. He had no kids to take care of. He had his free land. Pretty sure Emerson's wife was doing his laundry. Louisa May Alcott, meanwhile, is living a few miles away, making all the same theological points about simplicity and intentionality and virtue in what became her best-selling, funny novel, Little Women. She wrote in a way, though, that wasn't academic. While her dad sat in the study talking philosophy with Thoreau and Emerson, he didn't work for much of Louisa's life because he was a philosopher. Louisa got to work writing. In a world not built for women to have a voice, she found a way to have one. In a world not built for women to earn, she found a way to feed her family with that voice, and she did all of that while she was doing her own laundry. So I'm sure you can hear the edge in my voice. I was not the only one. We malcontents found each other and we bonded, and then we used our pent-up esoteric knowledge to play witty and very historically specific pranks on one another. So one time, some of our friends who ran a UU housing cooperative in Boston posted online that they were accepting applications for new roommates. A few of us applied as the famous Unitarians and Universalists. We applied as Emerson, listing Thoreau under pets. We applied as Michael Servetus, and under food allergies, we listed barbecue. I'm not enforcing that one, I'm just telling you what happened. We applied as people we thought were missing from our mainstream history, too. Reverend Olympia Brown, the first woman in the US to be ordained. Dorothy Dix, whose tireless lobbying transformed conditions for institutionalized people in the US, Canada, and several other countries. These women's names are not our best known heroes, but when you line their lives up against Thoreau in the Woods or Servetus with his letters, you can't deny that their stories deserve just as much acknowledgement. The Housing Co-op wrote back. They invited us for an interview, which was going to be tricky as we were all dead. The Housing Co-op also cautioned us in their letter that some housemates may not have experienced living with the dead, I love the may not, and may require education on matters of corporeal privilege. All of this was followed by a week of messaging and coordinating and giggling and pranking that left me feeling warm and connected. Connected with my peers and with my UU heritage, poking fun at things, lifting up other ones. The prank connected me with my values too. We were very careful to coordinate to keep things funny for everybody involved. Above all, the prank left me feeling a part of UUism. We understood the jokes because they came out of shared values. I mean, corporeal privilege? How UU is that joke? This was a space that had room for me, where I didn't have to change shape to fit into a prescribed shadow. And I didn't want it to end. So on a whim, I created a Facebook group and I named it the UU Hysterical Society. This was a play on the UU Historical Society, who have changed their name twice since then, so nobody gets my joke. People usually just point out that the word hysterical has a troublesome history, used as a weapon to discredit and sometimes harm women. And they're right. Throughout history, the symptoms of hysteria have been varied. Sometimes it was a woman who was struggling with what we'd call mental illness or a disability. Sometimes it was a physical condition like epilepsy or a life choice like deciding not to get married. Often it was a woman unwilling or unable to toe the line in some way. It's a catch-all for any woman being inconvenient. A hysterical woman is a woman who's the wrong shape. And I, who was struggling so hard to fit into the shadow of the cross, I loved my hysterical society. It was an expression of my values. It was a space that fit me. It was a break from the ministerial formation process at a time when that process was starting to break me. For years, I didn't think of it as anything other than Liz's personal refuge. By the time I clued in that something else was going on, we had about 20,000 members. Someone posted that she nearly drove her car off the road after spotting the UU church. She said she thought we were a joke religion made up for the purposes of the UU Hysterical Society, and that seeing a real UU church was like spotting a unicorn. She said she almost drove her car off the road yelling, "They're real! They're real!" And I thought, wow, we could be telling 20,000 people about what Unitarian Universalism is. And then I thought, oh crap, 20,000 people could be hearing about Unitarian Universalism from us. I wasn't the right person for that job, to represent us on that large a scale. I didn't finish the assigned readings. Fortunately, I didn't have to be the right person for the job. A religious educator named Kathy joined the team at that time and was able to fill in the gaps. Together, we stewarded the group as it continued to grow, and I toyed with the idea that maybe we should become something more, like maybe a legal entity, so we could apply for grants to fund all this extra work Kathy was putting in. But even thinking along those lines felt presumptive. I mean, who did I think we were? This is not a rhetorical question. I was really wondering, well, who are we and what is going on? And then, in November of 2019, something happened that changed my perspective forever. My friend, Reverend Hudson Dajijimana, a UU minister from Burundi, approached me for help raise money to settle a group of refugees. In November of 2019, the Hysterical Society held its first charity fundraiser. It was holiday themed because the Christmas story, as I see it, is heavy on the refugees. We sold funny PDFs like labels for wine that said, "Hey, this was water a minute ago," or tags that say, "It's the thought that counts, and I way overthought this." We sold flasks that said, "For when thoughts and prayers are not enough, and this is my spiritual practice." And we raised more than $16,000. And on one of my trips, arms full of flasks to the Canada Post Office, the post office guy said, "Okay, I'll bite. What is a hysterical society?" And I didn't respond how I usually do when asked what I do for a living. Usually I'm humble. I run a Facebook group that makes fun of my religion. This is not a very accurate answer, but it usually ends the conversation. Instead, I lifted my head up and I grinned and I answered with confidence and said we were a group that was about joy and community and refugees. We had started gathering around laughter, which is a good in and of itself. It's like a soup kitchen for the soul. But we were slowly turning into more than that. We were still about laughter and community, but also about bringing dignity to people who deserved a new chance to build a life. The Canadian not-for-profit Mirth and Dignity, Inherent Mirth and Dignity, was incorporated the following month. To this day, 100% of the profit from our funny merchandise goes to the charity that the Woods have founded. But most of what we do is support for forms of UUism that are not supported by traditional institutions. That includes the Hysterical Society, which is at about 300,000 members now. We partnered with a board game ministry and a project on TikTok. We did a comedy podcast, and most recently we partnered with online soulful singing. I could go on, but this is not an infomercial. You don't need this much detail. Unless you share our vision of UUism beyond traditional structures, in which case, talk to me about becoming one of the people who supports us with a $5 a month pledge. Okay, now I'm done. For now, what I actually want to draw your attention to is the overarching arc of the story, that feeling of not quite fitting, which is, I find, a feeling that a lot of UUs can empathize with. Many of us became UU because we didn't fit into the communities that we were born into. And we figured out how to be diverse theologically. And I think maybe right now, we're in the process of creating structural diversity, of welcoming a bunch of different ways to be UU and to interface with Unitarian Universalism. We have inherited a shadow of a cross, a set of institutions and practices that define real religion that don't always work for modern communities. I've heard from people who feel that they're tired, like they're trying to do too much, or they're focused on the wrong things. In our churches and in larger society, we are working ourselves into exhaustion, and our old structures are just not serving us anymore. What if we're not cracking because we're breaking, but because we're starting to turn into something different? What if we lean into changing shape, into a version of Unitarian Universalism that has churches in traditional and new ways, and also other types of communities, all interconnected in a symbiotic way? I have no idea where that would lead, any more than I knew where that Frank in 2015 would lead. But I do know that the first step is to give ourselves permission to be who we are, not who we think we are supposed to be, not who we've been in the past. What would we do differently if we saw ourselves as hatching right now? As the Leonard Cohen lyric tells us so beautifully, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There are cracks in everything. That's how the light gets in. I think it's true, but I don't think it's the whole picture. The cracks are how the light gets in, sure. Sometimes, though, the cracks are also how the light gets out. The cracks are where the hatching starts. Will you join me in singing When the Spirit Says Do?